Welcome, listeners. This is Sanjog Aul, your host, and the topic for conversation is making renewable energy a lasting priority. And I have with me Dirk Mahling. Dirk is the Chief Information Officer of Seattle City Light. Hello, Dirk. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Sanjay. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now that we know green and renewable energy is an important and buzzy political issue today, and we want to be environmentally friendly, but along with this discussion and need for change comes some serious business challenges about how we are going to make the most of our investments. And with that in mind, my first question for you is going to be that beyond PR reasons, how compelling do you think is the business value for a utility to embrace renewable energy sources?
I think it is very important. Here at Seattle City Light, we have been using renewable energy since the start. In the early 19th century, like Northwest utilities, we are heavily based on hydro. So we have a long and proud tradition of using renewable energies. We've since then added the wind and solar to it. And I think we're one of the few utilities in the country and the world who has a zero carbon footprint. That doesn't stop us from going forward and embracing new renewable technologies that come either on the utility scale or on the neighborhood scale, or even going down and working with individual customers on individual PV or solar or energy storage projects.
Now, for those who have treaded this path earlier, what specific challenges are they facing in making it a sustained reality? And are there any past successes and failures we can learn from here?
There absolutely is. I'm the CIO here at Seattle City Light, but I'm originally from Germany, so I keep watching the German example very closely. And Germany has acknowledgedly been a leader in renewable energies. There's windmills all over the country. There are solar farms every 15, 20 miles. And for a while, that worked very well for Germany. And currently, the price of energy has become prohibitive. There is a large debate going on in Germany and Europe how to continue financing it, because more and more customers have huge problems paying their bills. And we definitely don't want this here in the United States, and definitely not in Seattle, where we're proud to keep energy prices fairly low for our consumers. So the question becomes, how do you square that circle, bringing renewable energy into the mix and keeping energy prices low? And there is no single answer to it. It definitely has to do with bringing the consumers into it and making consumer technology, PV installation, but also electric cars part of the overall network. So I would see it for U.S. utilities as a question for how do you organize your distribution grid, and how do you make a distribution grid ready to deal with household PV, to deal with neighborhood energy storage, to deal with electric vehicles which are charged. The utility can help guide that process, but since the utility owns the wire, distribution company owns the wire, that is the piece where investment has to be made, and that's where the utility politicians and the consumers have to decide where the investments go in order to provide the infrastructure to link all these pieces together.
Now, when you refer to the example for Germany, are there any other areas where you see things are in progress and signs of success or not going the way you'd like to see them go in terms of how they're adopting renewable energy, what is being done in terms of funding it and how they're executing, and what are the lessons being learned from them?
The lessons being learned, some of them we've learned in this country, right? We just need to look at Solyndra and the examples like that. The market tends to have a way of sorting things out. Solyndra in this country being an example of how not to do it. And there are others, if you look back to Europe, where in the end the market does sort things out. I'm referring to, for instance, Q-Cell, which was one of the largest German manufacturers of PV modules, who basically went into insolvency, being pushed by their Chinese competitors. And that only lasted for a while, because now the largest Chinese manufacturers are in trouble too. The whole PV industry is in trouble. So that's definitely a way not to go, because it's not sustainable. It has all the signs of a bubble. I think Seattle has shown in the Northwest how with hydro, with renewable energies, you can be in business for over 100 years and not live on a bubble. And we want to build on that proud tradition in cautiously putting consumer and neighbor PV in working around microgrids. We also see this as part of the resilience. Here in Seattle, we're prepared for mudslides, earthquakes. We have two volcanoes here. Something may happen. If a disaster happens, we want to have a certain amount of resilience, and microgrids and renewable energies are a way of adding value to it that goes beyond just the free fuel factor.
Now, how will the inclusion of renewable energy change the expectations of the consumer and the behavior of the distribution channel? For example, will it become like cable TV, where we need to sign up in advance to use a certain amount of power and pay more money? Or will it make executives rethink their energy procurement policies due to obvious fluctuations in the renewable energy prices, and that will create an impact on the profit margins?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question and goes into rate design and the whole governance of renewable energy and energy market, which is definitely outside of my area of expertise. I'm the CIO, so I make sure that we have information flowing and that we have energy flowing for our customers. I'm not a regulator or a rate or tariff expert. I know there are many regions in the United States where you have a choice for your generator. So people may not know the details, but just in the top level, the utility industry in most parts of the United States is broken into the generation of electricity, either through nuclear or coal or gas or renewable, the transmission to the metropolitan centers, and then the final distribution, the last mile. In some regions, this is done by 3 different companies, and the consumer in the Massachusetts have a choice who they want to generate their electricity, and of course have a choice there to go green, which then is somewhat more, the cost of the kilowatt hour is higher than if you took the lowest bidder. But now the consumer has choice, and it's again markets that help sort out some of these issues on a higher level. We can say, no, I do not want to buy nuclear power. I want to go green. Or you say, I'm on a budget and I personally don't really care as long as it's most cost effective for me.
Let's take a quick break, listeners. We'll be right back and then look at smart grid as a good approach to actually bringing renewable energy into the mix and then still make it a very viable option and a successful element for how utilities work. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back.
The U.S. and Canada represent just 5% of the global population, but collectively we consume about 35% of the world's resources. Supply is not keeping up with demand, so change is not an option, it's imperative. Siemens brings knowledge to power through modernization, responsible energy consumption, and greening the grid projects. Siemens Smart Grid has the answers. Just Google Lead the Charge portal.
You are listening to CIO Talk Radio Viewpoint.
Welcome back. Again, Dirk, it seems that smart grid is to renewable energies what supply chain is to a manufacturer. So are utilities recognizing this and making investments in smart grid a prerequisite to any renewable energy adoption initiative?
No, not necessarily. The utilities provide the backbone or the interconnection. Let me give you 2 examples. In a previous life, I worked for a large contract research organization, and we looked at a concept for home PV. How can a homeowner put a PV array on their roof in an afternoon, almost going to a home store and buying with all the cable and all the PV panels and putting them up on a roof and connect them. That would be one example for distributed generation, which then needs to be managed by the utility in 2 ways, if it's not just for home consumption. And those 2 ways are electrical connection. So you need to have those home or neighborhood PV arrays, distributed generation arrays, connected to the distribution grid, which now needs to run forward and backwards, so to say. The traditional distribution grid is a top-down model where the power flows from the plant all the way to the smaller and smaller transmission and then distribution channel. With distributed generation, that needs to flow backwards because it flows from the endpoint to a substation and then gets redistributed. That is a challenge to the utility, and the smart grid can help there to forecast when and where distributed generation happens. The smart grid can help to monitor the flows of electricity to make sure that distribution lines are not overtaxed, to make sure that the standards that the utility has to hold 60 hertz voltage for distribution, that there is no reactive power quality considerations. That all happens, which the consumer or a distributed generator would really not be concerned. With a smart grid, we start to get the capability. And it's interesting to look at substations and the distribution grid because usually the industry has focused on smart metering. And that was in many utilities the entrance point for the smart grid. I personally think that looking at distribution automation and substation automations, you are working at an angle where you provide infrastructure that actually allows consumers and the citizens to participate with their individual distributed generation arrays. A second example may be demand response. Are you familiar with that concept, Sanjay?
Yeah, yes, to a little bit, but please expand on that, please.
Yeah, certainly. Demand response is the idea that a signal gets sent either from a utility or from an ISO, from a program sponsor who monitors the overall electrical grid. And we're starting to see a peak. We can either switch on new generation. We can ask consumers, small and large, to reduce on a predefined schedule, and we will ride through that peak. Again, you need the information from the smart grid to see that peak and to predict it, but then you need to communicate with all those loads on your grid to inform them that the time has come to do that demand reduction. So now you have two examples, one being the PV distributed generation, the other one being the demand response. Your communication network sit on top of electrical network, and where the distribution network really is the place where these things are happening. It's not happening at the power plant. It's not necessarily happening in the transmission network, but it's happening in your neighborhood distribution network, which now works basically upstream and downstream, closely monitored by sensors, overlaid predictions, and controlling.
Now, what is needed for the easy and cost-effective integration of renewable energy into legacy utility infrastructure and information systems in order for it to be a viable proposition? Yeah, go ahead.
From our point of view, it is definitely substation and distribution grid upgrades. The grid that touches the part of the grid that touches the consumer needs to be able to handle the requirements, both from an electrical and an informational standpoint. And I'm going back to the example of Germany. There are utilities where up to 40% of their load at certain times comes from solar, wind, and renewables in the neighborhood. And the biggest problem is paying for the upgrades of the distribution grid of the substation. So that is the question: how much political will and how much economic will is there to provide these upgrades, either through grants or through tariff? But somehow the infrastructure needs to be there to accommodate the growing distributed generation and the initiatives that individual citizens make.
Now, when you spoke about the funding and other type of resources, do you think the utilities have enough resources, the right resources in terms of people, processes, and technology to make this happen? And if there is a gap, then what external help and or additional resources are needed?
Yeah, pretty good question. In a way, I cannot talk for the whole industry, so I'm basing this mostly on what we do here at Seattle Light and what my friends in neighboring utilities do. In order to be cost effective, of course, we don't have a lot of people who can be immediately repurposed to do some of these things. We have a number of strategic initiative projects going on here in Seattle to prepare for that. We're working on substation automation. We're working on distribution automation. We're working at undergrounding of cables. And I know that my friends in other utilities do the same, in particular back east, where the hurricanes have really driven this point home that distributed generation helps with disaster management. The point, though, is it doesn't come for free, so the utilities are ready to do it. And the other element in this mix are vendors. So you have the large, I call them OT vendors, operational technology vendors, people who manufacture, build, sell energy management systems, distribution management systems. So these are computerized IT systems that in the utility usually run under the heading of OT, operational technology. And there's a convergence happening between IT and OT. But the utilities, to a certain extent, are not only looking at the customers, the ratepayers, and the governing bodies, but also at the vendors to come up with technologies or innovations that help to use the current infrastructure to do more for a cost-effective transition or upgrade path so that they can handle all these things that we talked about.
Once again, thank you so much, Dirk, for sharing your thoughts and insights about making renewable energy a lasting priority.
It's been my pleasure to speak with you, Sanjay, and I hope that our listeners got a few ideas out of it.
Thank you once again. And listeners, I invite you to find more conversations about smart grid on our website at www.ciotalkradio.com/smartgrid.